The skies darkened ominously over the Montana Territory as Victoria Faulkner stood on her porch, watching the swollen river breach its banks after 3 days of relentless spring rainfall. She had never seen the valley floor transform so quickly, the rushing waters swallowing everything in their path with terrifying speed. Victoria gathered her skirts and rushed back inside the small homestead she'd built with her own hands over the past 2 years. Since arriving from Boston in 1874, she'd learned to survive on her own, but nothing had prepared her for this. Water was already seeping under her door as she frantically grabbed her father's pocket watch, her mother's locket, and the small leather-bound journal containing her life's memories. "Please, Lord, not everything I've worked for," she whispered, fighting back tears as she stuffed a few essentials into a canvas bag. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath her feet as the foundation began to shift. Victoria knew she had minutes, not hours, before the entire structure might be swept away. She slung the bag across her body and waded out the front door, gasping as the cold water immediately rose to her knees. The land sloped upward to the east, toward the foothills. If she could reach higher ground, she might survive this. Victoria hitched up her sodden skirts and began to push forward against the current, her boots sinking into the muddy earth beneath the floodwaters. The rain pelted her face as she struggled forward, each step more difficult than the last. What had been a gentle stream between her property and the eastern ridge was now a raging torrent, cutting off her escape route. Victoria felt panic rising in her chest as the water climbed past her waist, the current threatening to sweep her feet from under her. "Hello." She screamed, though she knew it was futile. Her nearest neighbor was old Mr. Peterson, who lived 2 miles downriver, likely in worse straits than she was. "Anybody," the roar of the water nearly drowned out the sound of hoofbeats. Victoria turned, barely able to keep her footing, and saw a rider cutting across the ridge above her. He was tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the driving rain. "Hold on," the man shouted, guiding his horse down the slope toward her. The chestnut stallion seemed uneasy with the floodwaters, but responded confidently to its rider's commands. As they drew closer, Victoria could see the man was dressed in worn riding clothes, a duster flapping around his legs, his face partially obscured by a rain-soaked bandana. "The water's rising too fast," she called out. "The bridge is gone." The rider assessed the situation quickly, his eyes startlingly blue against his tanned skin sweeping over the churning waters surrounding her. "Grab my hand," he shouted, extending his arm as he maneuvered the horse as close as he dared. Victoria lunged for his outstretched hand, her fingers slipping against his wet skin before he caught her wrist in a firm grip. With a powerful heave, he pulled her from the water and swung her up behind him on the horse. "Hold tight," he commanded, and Victoria wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse scrambled up the muddy slope away from the flooding valley. They rode in tense silence, the only sounds the horse's labored breathing, the pounding rain, and the distant roar of water consuming everything in its path. Victoria looked back once to see her cabin partially submerged, the roof still visible but tilting as the foundation gave way. 2 years of independence, of proving herself in this harsh territory, gone in minutes. When they reached the relative safety of the ridge, the man slowed his horse and turned in the saddle to look at her. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a strong jawline with several days' worth of stubble. "You all right, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they weren't shouting over the storm. Victoria nodded, suddenly aware of how tightly she was clutching him. She loosened her grip slightly but didn't let go. "Yes, thanks to you, I'm Victoria Faulkner." "Mason Mercer," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in greeting despite the rain still pouring down on them. "We need to get to higher ground before this whole ridge gets cut off. My place is a few miles east if you'll permit me to take you there." Victoria glanced back at the valley, now a vast lake where homes and fields had stood hours earlier. She had nowhere else to go. "I would be most grateful, Mr. Mercer." Mason nodded and turned the horse eastward, keeping to the spine of the ridge as they made their way through the storm. Victoria clung to this stranger, this cowboy who had appeared from nowhere like an answer to her desperate prayers. and tried not to think about all she had just lost. They rode for nearly an hour, the rain gradually lessening to a steady drizzle as they climbed higher into the foothills. Victoria was chilled to the bone, her clothes soaked through, but the solid warmth of Mason's back against her chest kept her from complete misery. "There it is," Mason finally said, pointing toward a sturdy log cabin nestled in a protected hollow. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a corral stood adjacent to a small barn. It wasn't large, but it looked well built and, most importantly, was situated well above any potential floodwaters. As they approached, the cabin door swung open and an older man with a gray beard stepped out, rifle in hand. "It's me, Frank," Mason called out. "Got someone who needed help." The man lowered his rifle and nodded. "Storm's something fierce, valley's flooding bad." "Worst I've seen," Mason replied, dismounting and then reaching up to help Victoria down. Her legs nearly buckled as she slid to the ground, stiff from the ride and weak with exhaustion. Mason steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "This is Miss Faulkner. Her place was being washed away when I found her." Frank nodded sympathetically. "Got a pot of stew on and coffee brewing. Best get inside before you catch your death." Victoria followed the men into the cabin, grateful for the wave of warmth that greeted her. The interior was simple but comfortable, a main room with a fireplace, table, and chairs, with what appeared to be two smaller rooms extending off the back. "Frank's my foreman," Mason explained. "He was checking on the livestock when the storm hit. Decided to wait it out here instead of trying to make it back to the main house." "Main house?" Victoria asked, confused. "The Mercer Ranch is about 2 miles further east," Frank explained. "This is just an old line cabin we use during calving season or bad weather." Victoria nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of her situation. She was alone, her home destroyed, dependent on the kindness of strangers in a territory where such kindness wasn't always freely given. "Let me get you something dry to wear," Mason said, disappearing into one of the back rooms. He returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're clean. You can change in there." He nodded toward the room he'd just left. Victoria accepted the clothes with murmured thanks, too tired and overwhelmed to worry about propriety. She changed quickly in the small bedroom, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs of Mason's clothes. They smelled of soap and open air, and despite their size, felt like a luxury against her skin after her sodden dress. When she emerged, Frank had ladled stew into 3 bowls and was pouring coffee. Mason had removed his duster and hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. He'd rolled up his shirt sleeves, exposing strong forearms as he stoked the fire. "Feel better?" he asked, glancing up at her. "Much, thank you." Victoria sat at the table, accepting the bowl Frank offered. "I don't know how to thank you both. If you hadn't come along when you did, Mr. Mercer." "Mason," he corrected, sitting across from her, "and no thanks needed, couldn't leave you out there." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the howling wind outside making the shelter of the cabin all the more precious. Victoria studied Mason surreptitiously as she ate. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably not yet 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind. There was a quiet competence in his movements, a self-assurance she'd noticed in men who were comfortable in their own skin and capabilities. "How long have you been in the territory?" Frank asked, breaking the silence. 2 years, Victoria replied. "I came out from Boston after my parents passed. My father left me enough to purchase the homestead." "Alone?" Mason asked, surprise evident in his voice. Victoria lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, I wanted to build something of my own." "Brave woman," Frank commented without a hint of condescension. "That lower valley can be tricky even in good years, too close to the river." "I've managed well enough until today," Victoria said, unable to keep a note of defensiveness from her voice. "My garden was producing, and I had chickens and a milk cow." The thought of her animals made her heart sink. "I hope they made it to higher ground. We'll ride down when it's safe and see what can be salvaged," Mason promised. "Sometimes these flash floods recede almost as quickly as they rise." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. Victoria blinked rapidly, not wanting to cry in front of these men who had already done so much for her. Thank you. After the meal, Frank announced he was turning in, leaving Victoria and Mason alone by the fire. Outside, the rain continued steadily, but the wind had died down somewhat. "You should take the bed," Mason said, gesturing to the room where she'd changed. "Frank will sleep in the other room, and I'll take the chair here." "I couldn't possibly. You've been through enough today," he interrupted gently. "I've slept in worse places than a chair by a fire." Victoria wanted to argue but found she didn't have the energy. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what happens next." Mason nodded, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Tomorrow." Sleep came surprisingly easily despite the circumstances. Victoria woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through the small window beside the bed. For a moment, she was disoriented, but then the events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness. She rose and dressed in her own clothes, which someone had hung near the fire to dry. They were still damp in places but wearable. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Mason alone at the table. "Frank rode out at first light to check on the main ranch and let them know we're all right," he explained, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Storms passed, but there's a lot of damage in the valley." Victoria nodded, looking out the window at the clear blue sky that gave no hint of yesterday's violence. "I need to go back and see what's left." "We will," Mason promised. "But first, breakfast." They ate quickly, and then Mason saddled his horse. Victoria climbed up behind him once more, and they set off down the ridge toward the valley. The devastation became apparent as they descended. Trees had been uprooted, debris scattered everywhere, and the normally clear creek that fed into the river was a muddy torrent. When they reached the spot where Victoria's cabin had stood, she gasped. Only the chimney remained upright, a lonely sentinel marking where her home had been. The outbuildings were completely gone, and mud covered everything. Mason helped her down, and Victoria walked through the debris, occasionally picking up a sodden book or broken dish, small pieces of the life she'd built. She found her mother's china teapot, miraculously intact under a fallen beam, and cradled it to her chest. "I'm sorry," Mason said quietly, standing beside her. Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her independence, her fresh start, all washed away in a single afternoon. "The land is still yours," Mason pointed out gently. "You could rebuild higher up on that rise." He pointed to a knoll about 100 yards away that had remained above the floodwaters. "With what?" Victoria asked, gesturing at the destruction around them. "This was everything I had." Mason was quiet for a moment. "My ranch needs a housekeeper," he finally said. "The position comes with room and board and wages that could help you save to rebuild. It wouldn't be charity," he added quickly, seeing the look on her face. "We genuinely need the help," Victoria considered his offer. She had her pride, but she wasn't foolish enough to refuse a practical solution when she had few options. "I would earn my keep," she said firmly. "I've no doubt of that, Miss Faulkner." "Victoria," she corrected, offering a small smile. "If I'm to work for you, we should dispense with formalities." Mason returned her smile, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "Victoria it is, then." They spent another hour salvaging what they could, which amounted to precious little, some cookware, a few tools, and the china teapot. As they prepared to leave, Victoria took one last look at the ruins of her homestead. "I'll be back," she promised softly, more to herself than to Mason. The Mercer Ranch was larger than Victoria had expected, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. It sat on a plateau, overlooking a valley different from the one where her homestead had been, with rolling grasslands perfect for cattle. Mrs. Holloway, the cook, welcomed Victoria with practical sympathy and showed her to a small but comfortable room at the back of the house. "Been needing help for months," the older woman said as she helped Victoria settle in. "Too much work for one woman my age, what with feeding the hands and keeping this place tidy." Victoria quickly fell into a routine at the ranch. She rose early to help with breakfast, spent the mornings cleaning and doing laundry, and the afternoons baking or mending. The work was familiar enough, she'd done it all at her own homestead, but the scale was much larger. Mason was often away during the days, riding out with his men to check on cattle or mend fences, but he always returned for the evening meal. Victoria found herself looking forward to those dinners when he would share stories of the day's work or ask about her life before coming west. A month passed, then two. Victoria saved her wages carefully, but the cost of rebuilding her cabin seemed daunting. She had written to her father's lawyer in Boston, inquiring about any remaining funds from her inheritance, but had received no reply. One evening in late June, Victoria was sitting on the front porch, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot day when Mason joined her. He carried 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to her before taking a seat in the rocking chair beside hers. "You've been good for this place," he said after a comfortable silence. "Mrs. Holloway says you've organized the pantry better than it's been in 20 years. Victoria laughed softly. "It needed a woman's touch. The whole ranch did," Mason agreed, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "My father built this place from nothing, but after my mother died, it became just a place to work, not a home." "How long has she been gone?" Victoria asked gently. 7 years now." "Consumption." Mason stared out at the darkening landscape. "Father followed her 3 years ago. Heart just gave out one night." "I'm sorry," Victoria said, understanding the weight of such loss. "It's hard to be the one left behind," Mason nodded, studying her face in the fading light. "How are your plans for rebuilding coming along?" Victoria sighed. "Slowly. Materials cost more than I remembered, and without a reply from Boston, I'm not sure when I'll have enough saved." "You know," Mason said carefully, "there's no rush for you to leave. The position here is yours for as long as you want it." Victoria looked at him, noting the earnestness in his expression. "Thank you, I've grown quite comfortable here." Something shifted in Mason's eyes. "Just comfortable," Victoria felt her heart quicken. Over the past months, she tried to ignore the growing attraction she felt toward him, his quiet strength, his kindness, the way his rare smile transformed his serious face. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more. "Perhaps more than comfortable," she admitted softly. Mason set his glass down and leaned forward. "Victoria, Mr. Mercer," Frank's voice called from the direction of the barn. "Rider coming in fast." Mason stood immediately, his expression shifting to concern. "Stay here," he told Victoria before striding toward Frank. Victoria watched as a rider galloped into the yard, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. The man spoke urgently to Mason, gesturing back the way he'd come. Mason nodded grimly and turned back toward the house. "What is it?" Victoria asked as he approached. "Trouble at the McIntyre place," Mason explained, already moving toward the gun cabinet inside. "River raiders, they've been hitting isolated homesteads up and down the territory." Victoria followed him inside. "River raiders." "Men who use the floods as cover to rob folks when they're most vulnerable," Mason explained, checking his rifle. "They hit McIntyre's place last night. Frank and I are riding out with some of the men to help track them." Fear clutched at Victoria's heart. "Be careful." Mason paused, looking at her intently. We'll finish our conversation when I return." He left with Frank and 4 ranch hands, riding hard into the gathering darkness. Victoria stood on the porch until she could no longer see them, then went inside to help Mrs. Holloway prepare food for when the men returned. The night stretched endlessly. Victoria tried to sleep but found herself listening for hoofbeats, worrying about Mason facing dangerous men in the darkness. She had just drifted off near dawn when shouts from the yard jolted her awake. Victoria threw a shawl around her shoulders and hurried outside. 2 of the ranch hands were helping Mason off his horse. Even in the dim light, she could see the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. "Mason," she gasped, rushing forward. "It's not as bad as it looks," he assured her, though his face was pale with pain. "Bullet just grazed me." Victoria and Mrs. Holloway helped him into the house and onto his bed. While the older woman gathered bandages and hot water, Victoria carefully removed Mason's bloodied shirt. "What happened?" she asked, gently cleaning the wound. It was indeed a graze, but deep enough to need stitching. "We caught up to them near the old mining camp," Mason explained, wincing as she worked. "They didn't expect us so soon. One of them got a shot off before they scattered. Did Did you catch them? Victoria asked, threading a needle with steady hands. 2 of them. The sheriff's got them now, Mason hissed as she began stitching the wound. Frank and the others are still tracking the rest. Victoria worked methodically, closing the wound with neat stitches as her mother had taught her years ago. Mason watched her face, seeming to draw strength from her calm presence. "You're good at this," he observed. "My mother was a nurse during the war," Victoria explained. "She taught me what she could." When she had finished and bandaged his shoulder, Victoria helped Mason drink some of Mrs. Holloway's willow bark tea for the pain. The older woman had discreetly left them alone, closing the door behind her. "You should rest," Victoria said, rising to leave. Mason caught her hand. "Stay, please." Victoria hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. "I was worried," she admitted. "I know." Mason's fingers tightened around hers. "When that bullet hit me, all I could think was that I hadn't told you." "Told me what?" Victoria asked, her heart pounding. "That I've fallen in love with you," Mason said simply. "That watching you these past months, your strength, your determination, your kindness has made me realize I don't want you to rebuild that cabin and leave. I want you to stay here, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." Victoria's breath caught. She had not allowed herself to hope for this, had tried to guard her heart against wanting something that seemed impossible. "Mason, if you don't feel the same, I understand," he continued quickly. "But I had to tell you, life out here is too uncertain to waste time not speaking the truth." Victoria leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his, a brief, tender kiss. "I do feel the same," she whispered against his mouth. "I've tried to remember my plans, my independence, but your independence is part of why I love you," Mason said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "I don't want a woman who needs me to survive. I want a partner who chooses to build a life with me." Tears blurred Victoria's vision. "I choose you," she said softly. "I think I've been choosing you since you pulled me from that flood." Mason smiled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. "Then marry me, Victoria Faulkner. Help me make this ranch a home again." "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Yes, I will." 3 weeks later, with Mason's shoulder healing well, they were married in the small church in town. Frank stood as Mason's best man, and Mrs. Holloway beamed from the front pew. The valley was recovering from the flood, green shoots pushing through the mud, new life emerging from destruction. After the ceremony, Mason surprised Victoria by taking her to her old homestead. The debris had been cleared away, and the foundation of a new cabin stood on the rise he had pointed out months earlier. "I don't understand," Victoria said, looking from the construction site to her husband. "It's still your land," Mason explained, "and while I hope you'll make your home with me at the ranch, I thought we could build this as a place to come when we need time away, a reminder of where we started." Victoria felt tears well in her eyes. "You did this for me." "I want you to know that marrying me doesn't mean giving up your dreams," Mason said, taking her hands in his. "It just means having someone to share them with." Victoria reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man seemed to understand exactly what she needed. "I love you, Mason Mercer." "And I love you, Victoria Mercer," he replied, drawing her into his arms. As they stood together on the rise, looking out over the valley that had both destroyed and ultimately given Victoria a new beginning, she realized that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find what truly mattered. 1 year later, Victoria stood on the porch of the Mercer Ranch, cradling their infant daughter Emma in her arms as she watched Mason ride in from checking the herd. The spring floods had come again, but this time they were prepared. The cattle moved to higher pastures well in advance. Mason dismounted and crossed the yard with long strides, his face lighting up at the sight of his wife and daughter. He pressed a kiss to Victoria's lips, then gently touched Emma's cheek. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his voice soft with affection. "Waiting for you," Victoria replied, leaning into his embrace. Emma refused her nap until her father returned. Mason chuckled, taking the baby carefully into his arms. "Stubborn like her mother, determined," Victoria corrected with a smile, "like both her parents." They walked together into the house that had truly become a home over the past year. The china teapot, one of the few things salvaged from the flood, sat proudly on the mantel, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. That evening, after Emma was asleep in her cradle, Mason and Victoria sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mason's arm was around Victoria's shoulders, holding her close against the slight evening chill. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of rebuilding your homestead?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "I regret losing what I built," she admitted, "but not the path that loss set me on." She turned to look at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. "The flood took my home but gave me a greater one in return," Mason's eyes softened. "When I carried you out of that valley, I had no idea I was carrying my future. And when I clung to you on that horse, I had no idea I was holding onto my destiny," Victoria replied. As darkness fell over the ranch, bringing with it a canopy of stars, Victoria reflected on the strange, unpredictable currents of life. The flood that had seemed like an ending had merely been a beginning, washing away one dream to make room for a greater one. Mason squeezed her hand as if reading her thoughts. "To higher ground," he said softly, echoing the journey that had brought them together. "And to the heart," Victoria finished, resting her head on his shoulder as they sat together in the quiet wonder of the life they had built.